Hello, everyone. Greetings. Welcome to the first lecture in our Color of Religion lecture series at the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. We're proud to be the only center in an American law school that focuses on the civil rights and civil liberties that disproportionately affect Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities through a cross-racial, interfaith, and interdisciplinary approach. And so we're very, very honored today to have Professor Boyarin, who will start off our lecture series looking at the experiences of Jews in the United States. And I can tell you, as someone who's read his work and has relied on his work for my own work studying Muslims in the United States, there are quite a bit of similarities between the experiences of Jews in the United States as a religious minority and the experiences of Muslims in the United States as a religious minority, particularly in the contemporary era for Muslims and also looking back in the past century as Jewish Americans were immigrating to the United States. So we're very, very lucky to have him. Before I give the microphone to one of my stellar fellows at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, I just want to put a pitch in for the center's social media. Please follow us on Twitter at RUCSRR. So if you have a phone with you, do it now. We have a Facebook account, we have Instagram. I've learned, although I am not a millennial, that I must speak the language of millennials. And thank you, students, for keeping me young and vibrant. And so social media is where the conversations have shifted. And we're also live streaming this for those who are not able to be here. And finally, I just want to thank Rutgers University and Rutgers Newark in particular for allowing us to do what we do. It is not without controversy. We like to talk about things that are sensitive, things that are important, things that are timely. And we purposely invite people who we know have a very deep expertise, including our esteemed expert today. So we thank you for taking time out of your schedules to come and learn and to engage in the intellectual life of Rutgers Newark and Rutgers Law School. And so with that, I want to very briefly introduce one of our stellar law fellows at the center, Mbalo Sangoro, who is a 3L student and is also has extensive international experience, very interested in international law. Our fellows at this center, as well as other centers, bring so much life and energy and experiences to our law school. And so we're very, very fortunate to have Mbalo on our team. So without, I will allow her to introduce Professor Boyarin.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. As Professor Aziz mentioned to you earlier, Dr. Jonathan Boyarin is well-versed into the study of Jewish religion. He's the director of Jewish study, professor of modern Jewish study, and professor of anthropology at Cornell University, the College of Art and Science. He holds both a PhD degree in anthropology from the New School for Social Research in New York City, and a juris doctorate degree, so a GD degree from Yale Law School. He also is the founder and co-editor of the journal Critical Research on Religion, which is a peer-reviewed international journal focusing on development of a critical theoretical framework on its application to research on religion. In 2016, he was elected a fellow of the Academic for Jewish Research, which is the most distinguished and most senior scholars teaching Judaic study at American universities. Dr. Boyarin's work centers on Jewish communities and on the dynamic of Jewish culture, memory, and identity. He has investigated these fields in a range of ethnographic projects in Paris, Jerusalem, and here the Lower East Side in New York City. Much of his work is in interdisciplinary critical theory, almost always from the perspective of modern Jewish politics and experience, and includes comparative work on diaspora, the policy of time and space, and the ethnographic of reading. An expert in Yiddish, Dr. Boyarin's most recent books is a transnational from, he has a recent book is a translation from Yiddish of the fire burns in Kos. He has also other books focusing on Jewish families, which is titled Jewish Families, Mornings at the Stanton Street School, and he also has another book that discusses Jewish identity and in your Jewish Indians and Christian Europeans. So the name of these books is Uncovered Itself, Jewish Indian and the Identity of Christian Europe. So in addition to being well-versed in Yiddish, Dr. Boyarin also speaks 5 other languages. I only speak 2 languages, by the way. He speaks French, Hebrew, Russian, German, and Latin. So please help me welcome our speaker for the day, Dr. Jonathan Boyarin. Thank you.
I promise you that as your CV grows, you will be speaking many more languages too. I'm going to do this as quickly as I can. I do want to have time for discussion, and it's a complicated topic. Thank you. I'm very honored to be here. In the fall of 1995, I began my first year of law school. I was fortunate enough to attend a school where a considerable amount of scholarly writing was required, since reading and writing were probably the only relevant skills that I possessed at the time. I was also fortunate to attend a school where con law was a required first semester course. Now, the annual supplement to our con law textbook that year contained a case that many of you may remember, titled Adirondack Constructors versus Pena. The Supreme Court ruled that federal guidelines offering financial incentives to contractors that hired minority-owned subcontractors were unconstitutional. The majority opinion by Justice O'Connor held that race-based action by federal agencies was subject to the same strict scrutiny test as action by state or local governments. Adirondack was consistent with the movement away from affirmative action in areas such as higher education, a movement which has provided the stimulus for much of the rhetoric of diversity that has circulated for the past few decades. What caught my eye upon reading Adirondack was 2 sentences in the exceedingly brief concurring opinion of Justice Scalia, who wrote, "In the eyes of government, there is just one race here. It is American." Ringing words, indeed. It might or might not be worthwhile to contemplate their relevance to what, a quarter century later, it distresses us to identify as white nationalism. Even then, I immediately recognized these words as ambiguous. Coming just before the rather more elaborate concurring opinion of Justice Thomas, which set out in detail the idea that under our constitutions, rights accrue only to individuals and not to races, whether historically dominant or oppressed, Scalia's words here might have been taken as expressions of an inclusive individualism, but they struck me as grandiose obfuscation. I decided I would do a critical analysis of Scalia's concurrence as one of my major required papers, but I realized almost the next day that that's the kind of thing Pat Williams could do in her sleep. The same annual supplement contained another case better suited for analysis by a student with a background in the ethnography of contemporary Jewish communities. The case of Board of Education of Kiryas Joel School District versus Grumet turned on the constitutionality under the Establishment Clause of New York State legislation establishing a separate school district providing special education exclusively for Hasidic Jewish children. The court deemed that legislation an unconstitutional establishment of religion, but in line with certain dicta of the court, the legislation was eventually redrafted in a fashion that survived repeated challenges, and the separate school district continued to function. Now, Kiryas Joel was, from 1977 until last year, the name of a village in Orange County in an area that had previously been part of the town of Monroe. If you've driven it on New York 17 from the New York Thruway and looked to the right just as you begin to head north, you've seen some of the crowded houses at the edge of Kiryas Joel. Most of the residents there are members of the Hasidic group known as the Satmar, after the town in Hungary where their deceased leader held his seat before World War II. Their lifestyle and social organization are devoted to the observance of the Torah, rabbinic teachings, and what they understand to be their ancestral communal ways. Individual and family behavior is tightly governed by communal standards. They identify with other groups of Satmar Hasidim in the United States, Europe, and Israel, with most other Hasidic communities, with all Orthodox Jews, and to a lesser extent, with all persons whom they regard as Jewish. Their relations with the non-Jewish populations among whom they live are often distant and sometimes tense. The children of Kiryas Joel in the 1970s and today all attended private religious schools, but arrangements were made for the provision at one of those schools of publicly funded special education services to Hasidic children with disabilities. This arrangement ended following the Supreme Court's ruling in a pair of 1985 cases titled Grand Rapids versus Ball and Aguilar versus Felton, that provision of publicly funded special education services on the grounds of parochial schools violated the Establishment Clause because of the inevitable excessive entanglement of church and state. At this point, the local Monroe-Woodbury School District announced that Hasidic parents who wished to have the public school district provide special education for their services would have to send those children into the local public schools. Whether at that point any school official thought this was actually a realistic arrangement is not for me to say, although the school district evidently had and declined the option of providing special education services elsewhere in Kiryas Joel rather than in a public school, rather than in a parochial school. The solution that was hit upon in this impasse was the creation of the school district of Kiryas Joel. It is important to stress the difference between the process that led to the creation of the village of Kiryas Joel and the process that led to the creation of the school district. The former followed statutes for the creation of new municipalities that were well established, though new municipalities are rarely created in the United States these days. The latter came about as a result of a special bill by act of the New York legislature. That legislation was immediately challenged as unconstitutional. Now, Justice Scalia, again in his concurrence, waxing more, waxing more verbose than he did in Adirond, ridiculed the notion that the state of New York had somehow established religion in Kiryas Joel. This is just worth quoting. He wrote, "I do not know who would be more surprised at this discovery, the founders of our nation or Grand Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, founder of the Satmar. The Grand Rabbi would be astounded to learn that after escaping brutal persecution and coming to America with the modest hope of religious toleration for their ascetic form of Judaism, the Satmar had become so powerful, so closely allied with Mammon, as to have become an establishment of the Empire State. And the founding fathers would be astonished to find that the Establishment Clause has been employed to prohibit characteristically and admirably American accommodation of the religious practices, or more precisely cultural peculiarities, of a tiny minority sect." Now, I suspect that partly because of his own strongly Catholic background, Justice Scalia was onto something in realizing that what the legislation accommodated was better described as cultural peculiarities than religious practices. But of course, neither the establishment nor the free exercise of cultural peculiarities is addressed in the Constitution and its amendments. In the meantime, Kiryas Joel has continued to grow to the point where evidently the degree of autonomy that its status as a separate village afforded did not suffice to allay ongoing tensions about zoning. Last year, the village of Kiryas Joel became a new town with the unlikely name for that part of New York State of Palm Tree. Like the village, the town is in fact named after Joel Teitelbaum, since the name Teitelbaum itself means palm tree. Now, Kiryas Joel was analyzed by several legal scholars shortly after it came out. Some compared it to Wisconsin versus Yoder, where the Supreme Court ruled that Amish parents could not be forced to send their children to public school beyond the 8th grade. But Yoder was widely understood as being about the right to opt out of the public sphere, whereas Kiryas Joel was about a community's right to have access to public services on terms consistent with its own mores. Moreover, Kiryas Joel can be seen as part of a constellation of situations where the fundamental rationale of local funding and control of public education, that is, the idea that all of the families and hence all of the children in that locality are part of the same community, breaks down, sometimes in intractable ways. For example, the school district of Lakewood, New Jersey, almost shut down at the beginning of this fiscal year, due, as one report put it, to the fact that of that district's 36,000 children, about 30,000 are Orthodox Jewish children who attend private yeshivas, meaning there is a steep imbalance between the district's state-mandated costs for busing and special education and its basic per-pupil aid. In East Ramapo, New York, near the New Jersey border, domination of the school board by Orthodox Jews whose children do not attend the public schools feeds charges of racism against the largely black and Latino public school population. I've already mentioned the zoning issues that led first to the creation of the village of Kiryas Joel and now to the creation of the town of Palm Tree. Kiryas Joel is not the only place where the needs of traditionalist Jewish families have clashed with suburban amenities. Thus, a local internet news source reported in November 2018 on Facebook comments made by Councilman Peter Bradley of Clarkstown, New York, some of whose students are served by the East Ramapo School District. The report refers to New Square, a municipality that, similar to Kiryas Joel, was created as a satellite community for a group of Hasidim, in this case the group known as the Skvera. It states, noting that Governor Cuomo was in New Square around the time of a November 2nd vigil at the JCC, the Jewish Community Center in West Nyack, Bradley intimated that New Square Jews and Cuomo weren't interested in mourning those slain in the Pittsburgh synagogue 3 days prior, like the, this is a quote from his Facebook post, normal Jews, unquote, in attendance. His Cuomo criticisms also referenced the measles outbreak that has gripped the Muncie and New Square area. Evidently, Councilman Bradley was roundly criticized for his reference to normal Jews, and indeed he apologized. But it's easy to imagine with a fair degree of confidence what he intended to convey by that obviously unfortunate and telling comment. Normal Jews are the ones who identify with other American Jews as Americans and as Jews, and will therefore attend a memorial service for victims of a shooting at a Reform temple in another city. Normal Jews eat, for the most part, the same kind of food I eat, or that other normal Jews eat. I'm sort of in between normal and not normal. And they shop at the same stores. Normal Jews dress the same way I do, and they have normal numbers of children like I do. Normal Jews speak and read English, and most of them send their kids to public schools. Normal Jews live on my block without threatening to bring all their cousins and make me feel uncomfortable in my own home, or God forbid, to string up a wire and thereby create a fictive fence for the Sabbath that attracts even more of their kind. According to the same article, in a follow-up interview, Bradley specified that he meant mainstream or Reform Jews outside Ramapo. Now, it would be wrong, I think, without knowing more, simply or exclusively to characterize Councilman Bradley's reference to normal Jews as anti-Semitic. At the very least, one might say that there's a strong element of class prejudice here as well. I should add as well that some of the amici briefs in the 1990s Kiryas Joel litigation were filed on behalf of what Councilman Bradley would recognize as normal Jews by groups such as the American Jewish Congress. It's also worth mentioning that the East Ramapo School District, which I mentioned, includes at least one member with a recognizably Jewish name who argued that the district should drop its expensive opposition to a lawsuit filed by the NAACP, alleging that the district had violated the Federal Voting Rights Act. It's worth mentioning that some of the most bitter opposition to the creation of these barely visible Sabbath boundaries that I referred to, I'm talking about what's called Eruv in Hebrew, has been led by normal Jews who share Councilman Bradley's fears. Probably the earliest and certainly the most profound fictional account of an encounter between what Councilman Bradley called normal Jews and what I'm calling here traditionalist Jews is Philip Roth's story from the 1950s titled Eli the Fanatic. It's set in the fictional town of Woodington, and the actual case from 1947 that seems to have inspired this story suggests the setting of Westchester rather than Rockland or Orange County. Eli Peck, a resident of the town and an attorney, has been hired by his fellow residents to deal with the awkward matter of a group of traditionalist European Jewish refugees who've set up a yeshiva, a boys' school, in an old house in a residential neighborhood. The opposition to the yeshiva is described in the story as the work of Eli's fellow Jews, though in the 1947 case the opposition was apparently led by non-Jewish residents of Mount Kisco. In the story, the Jews of the town want the yeshiva out, and the law seems to be on their side. The message they want Eli to bring to the head of the yeshiva couldn't be clearer. Tell this serf where we stand, Eli. This is a modern community, Eli. We have our families. We pay taxes. And Eli delivers the message. It's a matter of zoning. You can't have a boarding school in a residential area. Tzuref, the head of the yeshiva, is unmoved. On his way out, Eli notices another man and thinks of approaching him instead of Tzuref. But when he was close enough to call out, he didn't. He was stopped by the sight of his black coat that fell down below the man's knees and the hands which held each other in his lap. Eli makes no progress convincing the yeshiva to vacate the house. His friends are getting impatient, and they're especially incensed that the man with the black coat is coming downtown to shop. Eli, the old Puddington place. Old man Puddington will roll over in his grave. Eli, when I left the city, Eli, I didn't plan the city should come to me. And Tad Heller has another worry. Now it's the guy with the hat. Pretty soon all the little yeshiva boys will be spun down into town. Next thing, they'll be after our daughters. Eli, unwilling to call in legal reinforcements and unable to make the yeshiva budge, thinks up a compromise. Yeshiva personnel are welcomed in the streets and stores of Woodington, provided they are attired in clothing usually associated with American life in the 20th century. The compromise is rejected, but Eli nevertheless bundles up two of his best suits, one gray and one green, as Roth specifies that neither, that is, black, and delivers them at the yeshiva. The man is then seen in town wearing Eli's suits, which are too large for his small frame. A bit later, Eli is startled by the furtive delivery to his front door of what turns out to be the man's traditional clothes, and in the center, the mountain of black, the hat. He picked the box from the doorstep and carried it inside. For the first time in his life, he smelled the color of blackness. A little stale, a little sour, a little old, but nothing that could overwhelm you. Eli puts on the clothes and wears them on the main street. He goes to the hospital where his son has just been born, and seeing him in those clothes, they decide Eli has had his third nervous breakdown and sedate him. The last sentences of the story read, "Then a needle slid under his skin. The drug calmed his soul, but did not touch it down where the blackness had reached." In my brief précis, I've chosen to highlight the story's references to blackness. The man's black coat, his black hat, the smell of blackness, the penetration of blackness to a deeper place in the protagonist's soul than a sedative might reach. The story contains no reference to a person who is black, as we usually use the term in America. And yet I can't shake the feeling that if I were forced to choose, I would likely say that Eli the Fanatic is a story about race more than it is about religion. Or perhaps better, that, as Professor Aziz's current work reminds us, fear cast in the category of religion more often than not seems to slide into fear cast in the image of race. I was invited to speak this afternoon as part of a series on the color of religion, and I'm very aware that the case I've discussed and know best, Kiryas Joel, does not have anything ostensibly to do with race, racism, or racialization. But by this point, I hope I've planted the seed of the idea that discourses about traditionalist Jewish communities cannot be neatly categorized as either religious or racial discourses. Part of the reason that it's hard to see racialization here is that there is general knowledge that these out or manifest or traditionalist Jews are not the only Jews, and that there are other Jews who are much more obviously white, whatever that means, even if the United States Census records traditionalist Jews as white also. Perhaps one way to move toward the articulation I'm attempting here is to allude once again to Eli the Fanatic, and to the objection of the good people of Woodington to a man dressed in heavy black clothes and who speaks no English appearing on their main shopping street. We understand what Eli's friends were afraid of, that the blackness might spread to them. What if the yeshiva students did marry the daughters of Eli's friends? Their children and grandchildren might then no longer eat in the homes, become less part of the family, threaten the tenuous balance between Jewishness and whiteness that they had achieved. Of course, one of the core aspects of any racialization is the way that any member of the racialized group can be made to represent every member of the group, since the racial classification itself is taken to be a key determinant of identity. And indeed, under certain circumstances, traditionalist Jews can become a metonymy for all Jews. This is what German Jews feared, both in Germany and in the United States early in the 20th century, that the arrival of these poor, uncouth Ostjuden, these Eastern Jews, would threaten their own hard-won position in the larger society. Unlike Councilman Bradley's social world, where there are the normal Jews of Clarkson and then there are the troublemakers from Ramapo, for the non-Jewish neighbors of some traditionalist Jews, they simply are the Jews. One such usage was reported early this year in the midst of the debate about measles vaccination, opposition to which seems to be centered in the traditionalist communities, at least in the northeastern United States. The New York Times reported on an incident where a young mother seeing Hasidim in a store said, "Let's get out of here, the Jews don't vaccinate their children." Now, I've referred to the growth of Kiryas Joel, and the same is seen in other communities, both in New York City and in the closer regions of upstate. And that certainly has to do with some of the housing pressures and the zoning issues and the attendant racialized discourse that we've seen. From an anthropologist's perspective, what that means is that ultimately new endogamies, new populations that are mutually unwilling to have their young adults mate with each other, are created. Now, Eli's friend Ted needn't have worried that the little yeshiva boys will be after our daughters. Rather, the resistance of more Orthodox Jewish parents to having their children marry spouses from less observant families is well known, but secular parents are also likely to see the marriage of their children as a loss. A recent Pew poll is reported to have found that most so-called secular Israelis said they were more uncomfortable with the thought of their child marrying a traditionalist Jew than marrying a Christian. There's also been considerable literature in recent decades on the process by which, in Karen Brodkin's terms, Jews became white folks and what that tells us about race in America. That historiography is useful because it denaturalizes, it historicizes the racial classification of Jews as white. Extensive and ongoing discussions of what are called Jews of color have further disrupted that assumption. What I can only suggest for now is that in certain significant contexts, it may be wrong to think of traditionalist Jews as unproblematically white, and not only because of the color of the men's clothes. Everyone understands, I think, that we need to be able to recognize the continued force of binary categories in the United States while also understanding how dynamic a process racialization is. The very fact that Antonin Scalia could speak of Americans as a single race illustrates this. Meanwhile, the fact that there is conflict between Hasidim and African Americans does not make Hasidim white, any more than it makes a Korean greengrocer in an African American neighborhood white. The assumption that it would reflects, at least in part, the pressure of the argument about whether Jews per se are white or not. Like other Jews, but perhaps in differing degrees and along quite other social dimensions, they both share in white privilege, or better, enjoy some of the rights that appertain in theory to all, but are in fact often denied to those who are not recognized as white, and at the same time are not quite white, or only provisionally so. Now, my title for today was Religion, Race, and Family. For the most part, modern U.S. jurisprudence concerning the rights of Jews has treated them as a religious rather than a racial group. I've suggested that these categories and the boundaries between them are porous and unstable. I've also pointed to a growing group of Jews who manifestly reject the 20th century bargain by which Ashkenazi-descended Jews were tacitly allowed to enter the dominant white majority at the cost of giving up their own ethnic boundaries. That is, at the cost of allowing their sons to marry our daughters and their daughters to marry our sons. They call into question any simple assumption that Jews, all Jews, once became white folks in America and always will be so. They may be classified as white. They may well identify with other so-called white Americans for certain purposes. But what they care about most is perpetuation of their ancestors in and through their descendants. The story of Kiryas Joel is a story about zoning as it comes into conflict with the needs of large, non-wealthy families, and about the struggle over educating the children of those families. But family is not part of the vocabulary of the United States Constitution. We need new language, and we need to know more. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Boyarin. That was so informative.